Let's make sure your goals never miss a beat. Northwestern Mutual Financial Advisors are expert listeners. They hear what's important to you and help make it happen. It's a better way to money. Let's get started at nm.com. The Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company, Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
Close your eyes and picture something cheesy and delicious. Something satisfying. Ready in 3.5 minutes. Like a Kraft Mac and Cheese Cup. Available now at a store near you.
November is getting close, and that means that the election is right around the corner. For quality coverage of all aspects of the election and expert analysis on top stories from around the world, there's no better place than the DSR Network. Members of the DSR Network get exclusive access to members-only segments of our podcasts, an ad-free listening experience, and access to our Slack and Discord communities where you can connect with fellow members and us. For the month of September, use code SNARK for 30% off your subscription at thedsrnetwork.com/buy. That's code SNARK at thedsrnetwork.com/buy. Now please, enjoy the show.
This is the Daily Blast from the New Republic, produced and presented by the DSR Network. I'm your host, Greg Sargent. For the first time during this presidential race, Kamala Harris's favorability rating has crossed into positive territory in the latest polling averages from 538. That's a crucial threshold, particularly since Harris faces the challenge of introducing herself to the public within an unprecedentedly compressed timetable. But there's still a ton of work to do. Harris still has not fully rebuilt the Democratic coalition that ousted Donald Trump in 2020. And today, we're discussing all this with Nick Ahmed, the Deputy Executive Director of Priorities USA, a leading Democratic super PAC. Priorities has its own new polling that we'll also be talking about here. It sheds a lot of light on what's still to be done for Harris to finish the job and defeat Trump this time as well. Good to have you on, Nick.
Great. Thanks so much, Greg. Happy to be here.
So as of this recording, in 538's averages, nearly 47% nationally regard Kamala Harris favorably, and she's at a net positive for the first time. A new Monmouth poll also found her favorability rating at 50%. This is striking stuff. It's something Trump and the GOP are spending $500 million to stop from happening, with, ads attacking her as dangerous, radical, friendly to violent criminals, and so forth. Is this the combination of the Democratic convention and the debate finally reaching deep into the electorate? How do you think this happened?
Well, I think voters didn't know much about her before she was the nominee. I think she's taken an opportunity in the debate, in the convention, and advertising to introduce herself. Obviously, in her tour across the country, meeting voters, local news stations, and talking about her vision for America. So, as a Kamala Harris supporter myself, I think it's no surprise to see her favorability going up.
Yeah, I do think that the local coverage of her in different media markets seems to be a crucial part of this. I do think personally that she could be doing some more interviews with these places. I do expect that to happen. Do you?
Yeah, I think, we saw her go on in Arizona, and that's the most important thing, right? Is like, we know voters watch local news. We know voters trust local news. So taking the time in those specific states where, that will determine the Electoral College to introduce herself to those voters specifically.
During the 2012 campaign, Obama's people used to always say that independents watch local news, independents watch local news, independents watch local news. In some ways, things haven't changed that much. I mean, I think for all that we've seen since then with the explosion of online fracturing and so forth, that's still true, right?
It's still true, but also local news has changed. Like, people obviously watch it on their traditional televisions, but also people watch their local news stations on YouTube. They go online for their local news. So, those stations have adapted to, and so people are consuming it in different places. And that's the important thing for the campaign and for the vice president, is to introduce herself wherever voters are.
Right. And the communication challenges we'll talk about in a bit. First, let's bring up Priorities USA's new polling. You guys were just in the field in 7 battlegrounds: Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina, and Nevada. And you were trying to figure out whether the Biden 2020 coalition has consolidated behind Harris. You found a lot of progress, but not enough. 85% of young voters who backed Biden in 2020 are now behind Harris, which isn't quite there. You also found that of the young Black and Latino voters who now support Harris, a non-trivial chunk of them may not vote, also a potential problem. Can you walk us through all this?
We went into the field shortly after the debate just to take a pulse check on where we were. And I think we've made a lot of progress in the last 6 weeks. As you said, young voters who backed Biden in 2020, 15% of them are not fully behind Harris in 2024. And among registered voters who did not vote in 2020, there's important chunks that we need to persuade and mobilize. For example, 18% of voters of color who did not vote in 2020, but we think will vote this year, are undecided in the election. Only half of them say they're going to support Harris. There's a lot of room to grow that support, and the way that they break could shape the election this fall.
I mean, a big story of this election all throughout, including when Biden was in there, was that this kind of low propensity voter pool is out there and kind of all over the place. What we've seen in the special elections throughout 2023 and to some degree in the 22 midterms is that the highly engaged partisan voter who's paying close attention, you guys are winning those. But this low propensity type of voter, harder to get. You know, they were very alienated under Biden, really not happy with the system in general, not happy with the Trump-Biden duopoly choice or whatever. Still not there, though, with Harris, right? They're still tough to reach. What's the story there?
I think the story there is really that they live in a much more fractured media environment, that they're hearing things all over the place. They're honestly oftentimes not sure what's true, what's not. And so we need to be a lot more proactive in reaching across the entire media ecosystem, messages about Kamala Harris, and also for a lot of these young voters in particular, messages about Donald Trump.
Right. And your polling actually gets at this in a very interesting way. You guys found that there's a real communication problem with young voters and voters of color in that it's hard to reach the ones who live in areas that are kind of more red-leaning. And of course, there are some areas like that in swing states. Not all young voters and voters of color are in cities or college towns. You guys think that reaching these other ones outside of cities and college towns is critical, even though they don't represent a large portion of the voters in those places. Can you discuss the challenge there and why it's so important?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And something that we've been really focused on here at Priorities. We think reaching Black, Latino, and young voters is our path to success this year, but we need to be reaching all Black, Latino, and young voters. Half of Black voters say they live in neighborhoods where most of their neighbors or only some of their neighbors are also Black. The numbers are much higher for Latino and young voters. And so we're focused specifically on reaching those voters of color and young voters who don't live near other voters of color or young voters. They're often in small towns, in more rural areas or exurbs, and they tell us they're hearing less from Democrats than their counterparts who are in cities. So 67% of Black voters who say they live in an urban area say they're hearing more from Democrats than Republicans right now. But that number is only 55% for Black voters who say they live in a small town or rural area. And we see pretty consistently that the Black voters, Latino voters, and Asian voters who live in those areas are also less supportive of Kamala Harris. And so there's a lot of persuasion that needs to be done, reaching specifically to them and speaking to their lived experience.
It's really like an untapped kind of pool, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that we see is that Republicans tend to do a lot more broadcast advertising where they're reaching everyone in the state. And Democrats tend to micro-target really carefully, and we're leaving these voters on the table. And if we reach out to them, we think we can win their votes.
There's something really interesting in your data I want to flag. For those groups, young voters, blacks, Hispanics, what Kamala Harris says about increasing opportunities for entrepreneurship is very important to them. You find that when she talks about these things, these groups grow to trust her. They grow to like her. Why is that exactly? And what are the implications of it for the remaining weeks of this race?
Yeah, I think the entrepreneurship aspect is such an important part of the economic story. That a lot of the voters of color that we need to win are young people, they're young men of color. And when you talk to them about the economy, they don't really find it works for them. And they always, they have second jobs, they have jobs in the gig economy, they have side hustles, or they just run their own business entirely. Obviously, that's not all voters, but it's something we hear a lot in focus groups. And that's why we are really excited about what the campaign and vice president have laid out about entrepreneurship. We tested 5 different clips of her speech at the convention. And the one segment that really mentions what she's going to do for entrepreneurs increased her support by the most. She specifically named entrepreneurs and founders twice. It's also the issue of the 8 issues we're testing where she's increased her trust relative to Trump the most since entering the race. And now of all the economic issues we test, she's net favorable on entrepreneurship. And we think that story is going to be really important to tell and win back these young men over the next 50 days.
Young men are an immense challenge for Democrats these days, it seems. Now, reproductive rights also hugely important to those voter groups, maybe not quite as important to the young men, I don't know. You guys found that talking about reproductive rights really moves them. Can you walk us through that a bit?
Yeah, I think it does matter for young men, too. I think sometimes we silo abortion unnecessarily into targeting for women. We find that it does work for almost all voters, honestly, especially young voters. And for young men, we find that it works best in a frame about a broader set of rights, and particularly Project 2025, that abortion and the overturn of Roe is the proof point that makes all of that real. And so we think that's an important part of the story, too. I think from our perspective, we need to do 2 things. We need to disqualify Trump and show why he can't be reelected. And abortion and Project 2025 are the critical proof points there. And we need to lay out why they should support Kamala Harris and her vision for the economy, and particularly around supporting small business creation, is the critical proof point there.
Another big story of this election is how blacks and Hispanics are drifting a little bit toward Trump, particularly working class. What do you guys find on that? Why is that happening?
Yeah, I think there's 2 aspects. I think there was some, dissatisfaction with President Biden when he was on the ticket. But obviously, we've not seen total consolidation behind Harris to the levels that we want to see now that she's at the top of the ticket. And I think there is some genuine warming to Trump in that regard. And I think, honestly, the story is the same there. When we ask them, in particular, these young men of color, young black men, young Latino men, what they like about him, they like that he is a successful businessman, in their words. And they think that for folks like them, his policies would be better. And so that's why these policy agenda that Kamala Harris is laying out on entrepreneurship is so important to winning them back. I think the other aspect is young people generally, I think, are not always satisfied with the pace of change in politics, and so don't connect as much with politicians. And so we're having a focus in our advertising on featuring voters like them in the communication. So that's who they're hearing from when it's about Donald Trump or when it's about Kamala Harris, and having that sort of person-to-person connection that's becoming more frequent online through influencers and the like.
Well, okay, all these things are linked. There's the challenge of getting Harris's favorability ratings up. There's also the challenge of rebuilding the 2020 anti-Trump coalition, which entails bringing back these young voters, these non-white voters that drifted away under Biden. And that latter thing requires getting these groups to look at her favorably, by introducing them to who she is and what her plans are. Big picture, though, what exactly is the problem in getting that last group of those drifting voters back? What's holding that up? What needs to be done to make it happen?
I think the big picture is understanding, honestly, how they're consuming media. When we ask these voters, how closely do you follow the news? A large chunk say, I avoid reading or listening to news about politics altogether. The majority say they consume information about politics passively at best. They're on 5 to 7 different social media platforms a day. We cannot assume that the hits that the vice president is doing on local news or the debate or the convention are reaching them. And so we need to be reaching them with advertising, injecting that into their feed so they're hearing about her vision for the future.
Right. And so basically where we are is Harris is getting her favorability ratings up there, especially relative to Trump, where they need to be. I think that's bad news for Trump. There's still a ways to go on it, obviously. But a big part of this, of winning this thing, is to really make that final push to get all the good moments from the debate, all the good moments from the convention, all the good moments from the stump, which we're seeing more and more of these days. She's really kind of trying to saturate some of the swing states and stuff like that with her presence, which I think is crucial. You guys need to figure out ways of getting these little video clips to the phones of these people, right? I mean, isn't that
Right.
the bottom line?
Yeah, that's the bottom line. And I would add a fourth group to your bucket of, people in their community who support her. I think that's the best testimony that we can have with a lot of these voters is they trust people in their community, and getting them to speak about why they're supporting Kamala Harris will get the deal done.
Last question. What do you guys think of the head-to-head right now? The polling averages have Harris up maybe 2.8, approaching 3 now. Seen a few national polls, that quality ones that put her up a little more than that. We've gotten a good Pennsylvania poll that had her up 3 the other day. It's tighter than that in the averages. It's like within a point in the averages. It's a little bigger in Michigan and Wisconsin. North Carolina is a dead heat, which is really striking, by the way. I mean, if Trump loses North Carolina, he's in very big trouble. Where are you guys on the head-to-head? Do you think the polling averages are basically right?
I mean, we have this election, honestly, as close to a coin flip as you could have an election forecast. And I think that's what we're planning for, that, the last 2 elections were decided by, tens of thousands of votes. And that's the, hand that we need to be playing from this cycle, that we can't play like we're winning. We can't play like we're losing. We have to assume that this election is going to come down to a few thousand voters in a couple of states.
Makes sense to me. Nick Ahmed, thanks so much for coming on with us today.
Great. Thank you, Greg.
Folks, make sure to check out some good content we have up at TNR.com. Marcy Wheeler explaining why J.D. Vance's big admission about lying about Haitians shouldn't shock you. They've done this for years. And Catherine Stewart looking at Leonard Leo's extremely revealing letter to a dark money group. And over on the DSR network, check out the latest episode of Words Matter, exploring the themes of language and misinformation in the Trump and Harris campaigns. We'll see you all tomorrow. You've been listening to The Daily Blast with me, your host, Greg Sargent. The Daily Blast is a New Republic podcast and is produced by Riley Fessler on the DSR network.